Hi, my name is Giselle. I'm the Director of Communications for Slow Food USA and really happy to be here with you with two really great panelists for today's topic. If you're not familiar with Slow Food is an international grassroots movement. We are alive and well in over 150 countries. Originally began in Italy about 30 years ago. Encourage you to get online and learn more about Slow Food if it's new for you. This is a particularly great time to lean into all things slow food. It has become very relevant. We champion and support good, clean, and fair food for all and the many dimensions of that. And we're super lucky to have a really robust network of people who are expert and practiced in a really robust array of topics and activities and jobs. So today we have Adam and Abrah with us. They're going to talk about social permaculture, and I'm going to let them tell you more about themselves.
Thanks so much, Giselle. It's really an honor to be here with all of you across the country. I'm Abrah Dresdale, and I direct Regenerate Change, and we're really excited to share with you some of the thinking we've been doing about the application of social permaculture in this time of quarantine. I'll kick it over to my colleague here, Adam.
Yeah, hi folks. It's such an amazing gift that we all get to gather and learn from each other all across the country. And I feel really honored to be able to talk about this topic with you all today. It's something that both Abrah and I have been passionate about for many, many years. So we're going to give a really brief introduction to this whole field of social permaculture, what it is, how it can be a force for good in our society, and then we're going to spend kind of the second half of our time together really zeroing in on a specific technology of social permaculture that Abrah and I have both been working on that we feel is especially potent for our time right now as we're all social distancing and in quarantine. So I'm going to start a little slideshow. Hopefully you all can see that. And Abrah and I will be kind of trading off what we're talking about.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. And just one piece about process, we're going to try to make this as interactive as possible. So rather than wait for a Q&A at the very end, there will be a few inflection points in what we're sharing where we'll pause for questions or comments. So it can be a little bit more of a dialogue as much as possible over Zoom. So yeah, we're going to be focusing on building resilience for the quarantine with tools of social permaculture. Click. So as I mentioned, I'm the director and co-founder at Regenerate Change. Adam is a consultant educator at Regenerate Change. Just a little bit about what we do. We offer trainings and consulting services in regenerative design for change makers who are seeking innovative social justice and environmental solutions. So we span coast to coast. My co-founder is based in Berkeley, where we have a large hub. Adam is in Denver with another big hub, and I am here in Western Mass and generally the Northeast region, where we have a lot of training alumni and consulting clients all across the states there. And yeah, regenerative design, for those of you who do not know, is not synonymous with permaculture, but they're very complementary. And I'll share a little bit more about that. But first we want to go to the next slide. So Adam and I have spent the last 10 plus years doing research and scholarship and interviewing different thought leaders in the nascent but building field of social permaculture. And so we've done our best to put a compilation of thoughts out there. Adam's book came out in 2017, Change Here Now, Permaculture Solutions for Personal and Community Transformation. And my book will be out this fall, Regenerative Design for Changemakers. Both can be found on our website, which is regeneratechange.com. We'll put that in the chat for y'all. But you can certainly check out more about the books at the website. And we'll be putting together more social permaculture resources in this next year that are online. Click. So some of you probably are brand new to permaculture. It's can be a very confusing term, and you ask 100 permaculture teachers how to define it, and they will give you 120 different definitions. So one that we like to use is a practice of observing patterns found in the natural world and applying them to the regeneration of social and land-based systems. So that's, broadly speaking, one way to define it. And it really has three core components. It's an international movement spread throughout the world that really is tied together by a set of principles and practices. The term was coined in 1970s by two white male academics in Australia, but it's important to recognize that permaculture and the techniques it uses were not just invented 40 plus years ago by these two fellows, but really are an amalgamation of lots of earth-based and indigenous technologies for appropriate ways of living in harmony with the planet. And so we really need to recognize the shoulders we stand on and decolonize any appropriations from those communities. That said, permaculture is new in that it is an intentional design system that follows ecological thinking and is sensitive to the context of any site. And the last thing is, it's really an attitude. It's a positivist attitude. It's a yes, we can, rather than cynicism or collapse. It's focusing on the solutions and doing it through a systematic design lens. So permaculture has many, many applications. And we've been asking ourselves, why not apply the same systematic design thinking and principles and patterns derived from nature's inherent elegance and efficiency to our social landscapes? And so that's sort of the nascent but budding field of social permaculture that Adam and I and others are really excited about. Applying the wisdom of nature to improve how people relate to each other. And we can do this across scales. So if you look to the diagram on the right, really thinking about how do we design our own lives in the center? How do we then influence and design our change-making projects in the world? How do a collection of projects then influence organizations and institutions? And how can we design for coordinated culture shifts across those to actually create change systemically in larger social systems? And we know that's something that's so needed right now in this time of the pandemic, and thinking about those that are most vulnerable and all the social collapse that's happening. So how do we really look to the resilience and redundancy in nature to regenerate both from our personal lives to broader personal to societal trauma and healing that's needed? So we're really excited to share a tool with you. But before we do that, we want to just take a pause and see if there's any questions. Adam, do you want to add anything to what I've laid out so far in the framing?
No, I think that's pretty good. I think, just one of the things that continually amazes me the deeper I go onto this path of social permaculture is how very directly our understanding of nature maps onto how we can heal each other and ourselves and our communities. This is not just like poetry or metaphor. It's very real, it's very distinct. And as we move on today, and certainly we'd be happy to describe in answer to your questions, and you can dig deeper in our books, what some of those frameworks are that we're directly drawing from our observation of natural systems.
Yeah, and I'll just add, specifically for this talk, we wanted to think about the context of quarantine. And so much about the natural world is built on relationship. It's built on webs of mutuality and reciprocity. And we know that so much of this late stage capitalism period we're in is predicated on division and isolation. And so that's always been the case, but really highlighted in the time of this crisis. And so we want to use the tools of social permaculture as an antidote to this heightened state of isolation. And how can we design given these constraints that we're all facing around quarantine and social distancing? Yeah, so if there's questions, people want to put them in the chat box. We can have a little dialogue here around what we've discussed so far.
Yeah, and we can maybe just kind of keep going with sharing this framework of the kind of zones of community that is one of that key tools in social permaculture. But anytime that anybody has a question, just type it in the chat, and if we're at a good stopping point, we can pause and answer that.
Great. So in permaculture land use planning, one of the tools is called zones of use. And it doesn't always map out into nice concentric circles, but this is really a conceptual diagram that we are adapting here and calling it zones of community for social permaculture. And the idea is there is a land steward or a social steward in the center who traverses these different zones based on different levels of care, cultivation, in farms, it's management. And how do we intentionally design our interactions with each of these zones? So we find it really helpful to map them out and make them explicit, make them conscious, and then figure out where do we want to create design interventions to increase the overall health and wellness of each of these zones. So we're going to walk you through this framework and what it looks like, not for a farm or a landscape, but really for an individual and one's communities and social landscapes. And so we always start with the center zone, the self. And so much about literacy of the self is growing our self-awareness, our inner analysis of ourselves and the contexts with which we are raised, whether it has to do with identity, legacies, lineages, power, privilege, oppression, cultural context, and really situating ourselves. And through that literacy, it really increases our own personal transformation, as well as understanding our positionality with the other members of our community. And another reason that we like to place the self in the center is not for egotistical or individualistic reasons, but understanding, if you could see these concentric rings as a metaphor for the cross section of a tree. Can you all imagine that in your mind's eye? We've taken a slice of a tree and flipped it up on its side, and we're seeing those concentric rings of growth. And the idea is, whatever the sort of DNA is at the center, how healthy and whole is it, or how fragmented and diseased it might be, is going to necessarily radiate out to all of those zones of relationships. So in addition to the fact that our lives are totally precious and are deserving of care and wholeness and healing, it's also important to notice that whatever our personal patterns are, especially when they're unconscious, can get radiated out into all of the projects and organizing work that we do in the world. And so what kind of patterns do we want to be radiating into those different zones of community? So with that, I'll send it over to Adam to move us through the rest.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Abrah. So as Abrah mentioned, we start with ourself, and that's always what we return to in this social permaculture practice and framework. But of course, it wouldn't be social permaculture without it being how we relate to other people. So the next zone out is this really kind of close-knit group of 3 to 10 people. I think most of our interactions in our lives are actually at this scale, whether that's with your household, your family, with your best friends, or in the workplace. Most work we do happens in these kind of small teams. And so there's a whole array of practices and frameworks in social permaculture for how we engage best with this zone of 3 to 10 people. One of the primary things that's so important at this scale is really making sure that we can show up as our full selves. How many of us have been in, projects at school or at work where we're thrown in this group of people who we may or may not know very well. And even if we do know them very well, we just don't feel comfortable kind of, talking about where we're at. If we're in a bad mood, we feel like we have to hide it. Or if we're in a really good mood and feeling really silly, we have to be really serious, right? And so, ideally, in a regenerative social system, we've created the conditions in these small, intimate communities where we can really take off those masks, be our full selves, and create mutually beneficial relationships. And we can intentionally kind of understand what are the archetypes that we're each playing in these small groups, and have these different roles that mutually support each other in the same way that in an ecosystem, you have different kinds of species that are mutually supporting each other. Then as we move out, we go to this second zone that is roughly between 10 and 25 people. So this might be a collection of teams that are all part of one organization, or maybe it's a collection of apartments in an apartment building, or a group of homes on a block. And at this scale, a lot of the social permaculture analysis comes down to looking at who has power. You know, at this size, you start to develop cliques, right? You have these different subgroups of 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 people, and which subgroup is kind of having the floor and who's speaking more. Power isn't necessarily a bad thing in community, but we need to be explicit about it. We need to talk about who has power and why, and make sure that that power is shared on a regular basis, so that no one voice or perspective is kind of dominating the culture. And then the next level out is getting to, you know, larger groups of up to 100 people. And this is really when we're starting to look at the scale of an institution. Of course, a lot of organizations or businesses are smaller than this, a lot are larger than this. But really, I think of Zone 3 as how are we creating frameworks for organizations that have that kind of regenerative paradigm embedded in their DNA. So, you know, Abrah was mentioning that our own core values at the self are critical to this, and you know, the founder of an organization will imprint their strengths as well as their shadows throughout that organization. So it requires that self-awareness. It requires having a really strong and flexible organizational culture. And it requires a commitment to what a lot of people call the triple bottom line, right? Where you're not just pursuing profit or financial surplus above all else, but you're really looking out for the people in the institution, the people who the institution is serving, and doing as best you can to empower them and not just kind of use that missionary mentality. And then, you know, another really key thing that I think is important when we're talking about regenerative institutions is that they're regenerative, not just in, you know, regenerating their own money or having an impact, but being regenerative beyond the lifespan or beyond the tenure of the person who started it, right? No ecosystem falls apart after the biggest tree in the forest dies, right? And no institution should have to fall apart after its founder moves away or retires. And that can take a lot of forethought and intentional design to create an institution that doesn't need any one person or group of people at the center once it reaches maturity. Then moving beyond that, we're more looking at the scale of kind of ecosystems of institutions, ecosystems of organizations. So how do we build partnerships between organizations without kind of resorting to you know, hoarding mentality or competition mentality? How do we bring coalitions together? This is, you know, where you could think about campaigns to affect change in a community. And of course, this isn't just organizations. A campaign could be a bunch of citizens. Maybe it's citizens from different neighborhoods coming together and trying changing local zoning laws or something like that. But either way, at this point, you're dealing with lots of different groups with different interests, which may or may not be aligned. And it's a lot of kind of building trust among these different interests and finding common ground and building off of that. And then finally, the biggest zone is it, you know, when you get beyond 500 people and you're really trying to shift culture as a whole. You know, what is the social contract in my community? How do we really change the rules of the game? That's the kind of thing that we get to think about as we move beyond just the level of coalition. And each one of these things, you know, builds on itself, of course, and the bigger the zones get, the more time it takes to really, you know, create that regenerative culture. But if you start at that center and kind of, you could think about spiraling out through these rings of the tree trunk, you can really start to affect change at this scale using very, very simple and elegant frameworks. So that's a lot we've shared already. This is a great opportunity if folks do have questions to post them in the chat window. Definitely don't be afraid. No question is too simple or too elaborate. So we'll maybe pause for a little bit here and wait for folks to enter any questions. And if none come up, then we'll just keep going. But we'd love to hear where people are at with this so far. Abrah, do you have anything to add while questions are being typed?
Well, I really appreciate that wonderful description of the different zones of community. And, you know, if you're looking for something to do in some spare time after this webinar, you could start articulating for yourself. There'll be a recording of the webinar. Who or what individuals, communities, organizations exist in your different zones, and start making a map and assessing, you know, what is the health of my relationship with these different ones, what's my sense of agency and influence in these different zones. So that's just a thought. And we've got a few questions popped up.
Awesome. Maybe I'll take the first one and you can take the second one, Abrah, if you want.
Okay, great.
So yeah, Diane asks, this concept really resonates with me. Will there be good descriptions of how to implement these zones of community in your books? And the short answer is yes, definitely. I think this kind of zone framework is pretty foundational to the way I talk about this stuff in my book. And I refer to those zones a lot. And essentially, my book is kind of organized from the biggest level down. And then Abrah's book, which I love how they're kind of reflections of each other, starts at the center and radiates outward. So they each kind of talk about these zone frameworks in different ways, but they're pervasive in each of our books.
And to Eric's question, they write, can you share where you have seen in what communities that this has been most successful thus far? One thing to make a distinction around, I don't necessarily see zones of communities as a tool. I see it more as a lens or a framework through which to do our work. And so I think the more we can be explicit about which zone we are trying to influence or shift in our work, whether it's with slow food or sustainable agriculture or any other forms of change making, really using this as a framework and being explicit about what scale are we aiming to shift, and then what rings are we embedded in, and where are those strategic relationships, much like an ecosystem in a forest, that we want to be developing with the rings that are outside of us and also the rings that are nested within us. So it's really a way to get concrete and to be using these actual numbers. A lot of social research that has been gone into these different zones and understanding what creates different forms of intimacy, and then what is too big to take a hold of in terms of one-on-one relationships, and really looking more of a net pattern. So understanding where are you trying to leverage impact, I think, is a really great way to start. And we've seen that certainly in the regenerative agriculture community. I'm part of the Prison Food Justice Network. And so we use these frameworks to help inform our strategic actions.
So Felisa has a very timely question. What do you think about how it will be appropriate to start reaching out post-pandemic? And I'm not sure exactly, Felisa, what you meant reaching out about what specifically, but what I can speak to is kind of, the conversations Abrah and I and other folks have had about how this super unique circumstance that we're all in, and really kind of scary and dangerous circumstance, also is a mimic of natural patterns, and how, as social permaculturalists, we are thinking about this moment. So I want to share a concept in ecosystems called disturbance, which is something that happens in almost every ecosystem that's a big shock, a big event. So, a classic example might be a forest fire, or an earthquake, or a flood. And the thing about disturbance is that ecosystems have evolved over millions of years to not just be okay after a disturbance, but to actually be made stronger because of the disturbance. So, a great example is how, where I live here in Colorado, we have had forest fires for millions of years. We're a dry climate, and a lot of the coniferous plants, the evergreen trees, have what are called serotinous seeds that only sprout in the presence of the heat of a forest fire. So they actually need that forest fire to sprout their seeds, not to mention clearing out the underbrush, making light for the new saplings to grow, burning off some of the disease that accumulates over time. And so disturbance is something that happens not just in ecosystems, it happens in our own personal lives. If you think about like a breakup or moving across the country, that's a disturbance too. And so if we can really think about how do ecosystems take disturbance and not let it bring them down, but actually absorb it and use it to thrive, that's as much as possible the mindset that we are trying to apply as social permaculturalists. So obviously what we're getting at is we are living through a very real moment of disturbance right now. And I'm not trying to minimize the fear and the very real suffering from people who are fighting for their lives, people who have lost their jobs. And I want to acknowledge how that suffering is exacerbating existing inequalities in our society, right? It's like most of the people who can't afford to social distance are Black and brown people. They're people on the front lines, people who are one paycheck away from being evicted. But all of that is to say that this is a moment where a lot of things are being shaken up. And in these times when lots of things are being shaken up, lots of solutions are on the table. And lots of things that would have been considered crazy a month ago, 2 months ago, that are part of our visions for how the world ought to be are now things that people might actually be willing to consider. And as the dust starts to settle, as we slowly come out of this moment of crisis, we really have this golden opportunity to think differently about how we come together in communities, economically, socially, and do it in a way that is more regenerative, that does make us even stronger. So I'm not sure if that gets 100% to what you're asking, Felisa, but it felt appropriate to add there. All right, it looks like we have 1 or 2 more questions. You want to take Renata's question?
I was actually thinking, I think that would be a good one for you, for Hanata, and I'll take Kirby, and then we'll keep going.
Great. So I'll just answer real quickly. Renata, is the co-housing concept a type of these permaculture structures? Yeah, I would say definitely that co-housing is one manifestation of what it might look like to apply these social permaculture principles. I myself have lived in collective houses for a good deal of my adult life, and really feel like it's a very kind of rooted way to apply what does it mean to actually live deeply embedded in community with other people and to share each other's resources. I think the kind of nuclear family model that is kind of the default for us, or maybe was the default pre-coronavirus, is something that isn't actually well suited to how humans thrive and what it takes to run a household. We need more people around us. And that's why for most of human history, we've lived with our aunties and our uncles and our grandparents. And that phrase, it takes a village to raise a child, right? And co-housing is one 21st century expression of that I think is, yes, very much aligned with the permaculture principles. And there are a lot of ways in which social permaculture can take co-housing, which sometimes, in my experience, can be really not fun and dysfunctional, and a lot of co-housing communities fall apart. But social permaculture has a lot of design skills to offer to how to take those situations and really level them up and make them thrive.
And Kirby's question is, when you talk about regenerative institutions, do you mean these institutions relate directly to nature, or is nature coming later in the seminar? So we're really trying to weave in the teachings, the metaphors, the principles from nature as we go. But in terms of institutions, I think ultimately, yes, having in each institution, having an explicit relationship to the natural world, whether it's immediate and or thinking about downstream outputs or sourcing inputs, et cetera. Like, what is more of a reciprocal relationship rather than extractive paradigm with the natural world? But I think when we're talking about something regenerative, we're talking even more broadly than just a direct relationship or responsibility to nature. And I want to just share something from my book, Regenerative Design for Changemakers, that I think kind of elaborates in the way that we're using regenerative at Regenerate Change. Regeneration refers to a system's ability, or you could say an institution's ability, to evolve its own capacity and to build beneficial reciprocal relationships with other systems, however you want to name those other systems. These connected systems increase and distribute resources over time. So that's really at the essence of regeneration. And in contrast, the regeneration paradigm is very drastically different from a sustainability paradigm, where the goal is to sustain rather than degrade further the current conditions. But the question that we're asking ourselves is are these conditions something we want to sustain, or do we really want to evolve the capacity and regenerate what is possible? So yeah, I think you can extrapolate from that and think about institutions and what does it mean, both in terms of products and services that institutions offer, but also what is the culture among colleagues or staff? What is the culture between staff and beneficiaries, between boards and staff members, et cetera, and understanding how to create regenerative cultures socially within these institutions as well as externally. Awesome. So yeah, we're gonna keep moving. These are great questions. Thank you all so much for your engagement. Adam, do you wanna kick us over to the next slide? We're at an inflection point here, or a key point, as we might say in permaculture, water and slope planning. So we're gonna shift and zoom in a little bit from looking broadly at social permaculture and one framework, which was the zones of community, into a specific technique that we've been developing at Regenerate Change. And this technique is called social alchemy pods. And we really are seeing this as an exciting initiative that we had already been incubating over the last 6 months, that Adam's community in Denver has had experience with over the last handful of years. And we were rolling it out this spring, and then Corona hit, and we had already been thinking these would work very well virtually as well as in person. And so now we're really excited to share a tool with folks that I think other communities are certainly engaging with, but we're really having a social permaculture lens and framing around these ideas of social alchemy pods. So let's jump in and hear a little bit about what they are. So these are small self-facilitated groups that convene on a regular basis to create change. That's broadly speaking. And within that, they are each customizable. So when we say small, we're really talking about that zone 1 in the zones of community, where Adam and other colleagues and experimenters with this pod model have seen that 7 to 12 participants works really well to create intimacy, to track different relationships, and also to have enough diversity and resilience to make a robust group. Self-facilitated. So while there are 2 co-conveners that work with Regenerate Change directly and bring people together, everyone actually rotates facilitation. So there's not a monoculture leadership model, being just sort of one charismatic or martyr type leader that we see so much recapitulated throughout our political system. But we really want to encourage the sharing of facilitation and different people stepping up into taking leadership in their own authentic style, and leading each of these different convenings. Already shared that the idea is there's 2 co-conveners. We never want anyone to do anything in isolation in social permaculture. So we really believe in the buddy system. These folks bring members together, ensure that the alchemy pod is on track and has the support it needs, and through that serving as a liaison with us at Regenerate Change, and that they convene on a regular basis. So that could be decided by the group. It could be weekly, every other week, or monthly. And then the last piece is really to create change in a structured way. So we highly suggest that folks meet 8 times to experience a full arc of the convenings, and then to decide on what might be the theme around which this pod is gathering. So Adam's going to share a little more about what those could look like, but this is a really nice hybrid model where there's flexibility and self-organizing that a pod can take on, while also structure and ways that we support each pod, which we will share in a moment. So I'll go to the next slide, please.
Yeah. But before I get into the themes, I also just want to share, in addition to that great definition that Abrah talked about, you know, that I feel like these pods are so crucial in general, but especially right now in the world we're living in, when we are all physically so isolated. And you know, depending on our living situation, we might be living with our significant other or kids or roommates. We might be all by ourselves. But either way, you know, I think something I've observed in my work doing social permaculture is that we all need this kind of core group of people that check in with us, that we check in with on a regular basis. And while, you know, again, some of us might have that we're just now checking in with through phone calls or Zoom, it can be really helpful to have just a little bit more formality around it, not like a workshop or a class, but just a little bit more structure, and that we feel like these social alchemy pods provide just the right amount of structure. And you know, you can form this with people you already know, who you're already connected with, or it could be, you know, 7 or 8 people who you've never met before, but that by the end of this arc, you start to get really close with. So with that said, yeah, every social alchemy pod has a theme or a focus that kind of grounds that conversation that people have every time they gather, that they're kind of engaging in together. And so there's all different ways that focus could look. So one of them is through cultural identity. So it could be a group of people that share the same identity, who are coming together on a regular basis to talk about how that identity is influencing their work in the world, and to create solidarity with one another, and to build kind of confidence and competence. So there's a few examples of what that could look like here. Another potential theme is profession or vocation. So it could be you know, a bunch of people who all share the same, who all work for the same organization, or who are all freelancers but in the same industry, that kind of thing. It could be a shared circumstance, so people that just happen to all be together. So like I said, members of the same organization, or residents of the same neighborhood. You know, we're all living here in these same square blocks, so we might as well get together and deepen our connection and mutual reciprocity with one another. And then finally, a theme could be around a shared goal, a group of people who all have one specific cause that they're trying to work towards, and that they're coming together, not necessarily to be super, this wouldn't be the place where they're getting super into the nitty gritty of how they're like planning their events or things like that. But it's more like we're building that foundation, that shared relationship. We're fertilizing the soil, so to speak, of our relationships with one another, so that when it comes to the actual activism in our lives that we're doing, that we're going to be that much more effective. So those are just a few different ways that these social alchemy pods can look. And then I'll share real briefly what that looks like from our perspective at Regenerate Change, how we are supporting this tool for ecological and social regeneration. So like Abrah said, I've done a lot of experimentation with these pods myself over the last several years. I've led some, I've been in lots of others, I've done virtual ones and in-person ones, and I've really seen how they've changed my life, they've changed the lives of the people going through them. And I've started to figure out what are the essential things that people need to know to run them. And we're starting to put that together into a handbook. And so the way these social alchemy pods will start is that 2 co-conveners come together and approach us at Regenerate Change and say, hey, we are here and we want to start a pod. And we say, great, here's the guidebook. And the guidebook is lots and lots of information about what you need to know to start a pod, kind of holding your hand through each step of that process. And then those co-conveners, once they gather, you know, 5 to 10 people, they get access to monthly calls that we're going to host with all of these co-conveners. And then they actually get a small stipend. The idea is that all of the participants in the pod will throw down on a sliding scale a small amount for each convening, and that some of that amount will go back towards the co-conveners so that they can be compensated for the time they're putting in to organize this group. And then the third thing we'll be doing at Regenerate Change is connecting all of these social alchemy pods across the country. So we're working on creating a platform for participants and co-conveners of these pods, and consolidating resources. So if one pod comes up with a really cool activity, that they can send it to our database, and other pod conveners can use that for their social alchemy pod as well. And this
do you
is,
mind flipping back to the last slide just for a
yeah.
moment? Yeah, I just want to also add, and as part responding to a few questions coming up of how is this distinctive from other groups that have formed over the past. You know, I think one of the unique things that the Social Alchemy Pod affords is actually through the guidebook, in addition to the nitty-gritty of how to get one going and run it, we've actually are putting together very both flexible but structured different models of ways to apply regenerative design thinking to the individual scale and that zone 1 scale of up to 12 people. So it's sort of like a hybrid community of practice using regenerative design thinking and understanding how to apply it to our own lives and to our change-making work. And then it's a hybrid also of learning different forms of shared leadership, having a community that's really a home base. It's a place to share vulnerably with each other and to learn from each other. And especially during this time of quarantine and of social isolation, it's a really nice thing to know that you have this particular group with a shared aim to drop into. So we mentioned for those 8 convenings, the first 3 are very structured, and it lays out, you know, different activities and exercises to build group unity and trust, sense of identity and understanding who each person is in the room. And then for the second half of the convenings, there is a suggested structure, but sort of a choose your own theme. And so we also have some content in the guidebook, whether it's around anti-racism, whether it's around radical self-care, whatever it is, we have some different ideas peppered in, but we're also relying on the collective intelligence and toolboxes of the various participants there to offer different frameworks or practices that they want to share when it's their opportunity to facilitate. So I just wanted to share that's a little bit of what makes a social alchemy pod distinctive. And the idea that we are inviting people to bring their whole selves. So it's not specifically, even if it's, say, a professional pod, we're inviting people to bring in their creative side, their emotional side, their spiritual side, their whole selves into these places while being organized around a certain theme. So there's some things that really make this unique, and we think that that will have a tipping point towards creating more regenerative culture, broadly speaking.
Yeah, thank you, Abrah, for that additional context. So we just want to kind of wrap up and then kind of answer any other questions y'all have with kind of sharing how you can learn more about this stuff. So this is the webpage, regeneratechange.com/SAP, where you can see at the bottom it says learn more about SAPS here. That takes you to a whole white paper that we've written that kind of goes into much more detail about what the kind of theory behind this stuff. And then there's a place where you can kind of see these different roles of as a participant in one of these alchemy pods, as a co-convener and playing that role. And then, you know, something we haven't talked about a lot today is that we're also really excited about the potential to set up these kind of networks of alchemy pods within existing institutions. So for example, Slow Food, as a national organization that has chapters and members across the country, we would work with an organization like Slow Food to set up a whole network of these pods for their members, and their members could really start to build relationships, deeper relationships with each other. There could be custom content that's connected to the mission and values of Slow Food. So that's another way that we're envisioning these pods can integrate with existing institutions. So there's information about all of that on the website as well. All right, so that is kind of all of the info that we wanted to share with y'all. But again, we'd love to keep the conversation going, keep this interactive. So please let us know what's coming up for you after seeing this information about social permaculture and social alchemy pods. What are you interested in? What are you excited about? What are you confused about? Yeah, we'd love to hear more questions in the chat.
Yes, and please do stay in touch. If folks need to sign off early, you can follow us on Instagram at Regenerate Change. And if you're interested in finding out upcoming trainings or different resources to engage with content we've been developing, you can email us at info@regeneratechange.com.
Thank you guys so much. That's really fantastic. And I think you're right. It's could be a really wonderful model for an organization like Slow Food. So I would like to throw a question out to you here, both on behalf of Slow Food and in the hopes that this might be relevant to the folks listening. Where do we start? I think this is, if this is new, if it's a new concept for any of us, I think sometimes coming on board, like I'm all in, you know, right now I say, yes, this sounds perfect for us, but where do I start? How do I kind of get into this with my organization or myself or a group I'm putting together?
Yeah, so basically, you know, it depends on if it's specifically for an organization or existing network. Getting in touch with us, and that would be more of like a consulting opportunity. We'd really work to customize based on what your goals are and what you're trying to develop and what have been some of the weak links in the actual fabric of the network. And so we're actually currently working with the Jewish Farmer Network, which is in the US and Canada, to do just this right now. And so it's really a bit of an inventory phase of understanding from the leaders to the participants what is needed and where can this really fill those existing needs, and then understanding what the content area is. Does it make sense to group folks by theme or by region or both? And then we would set these up. We have these monthly calls with the co-conveners to sort of coach and resource folks as needed. And then we also can develop certain content that would be specific for those last meetings, the convenings like 4 through 8, for based on what you're looking for. And one thing we didn't mention is that it's a minimum commitment of 8 convenings, but that they are renewable. And so after the 8 end, new members can join on, existing members can stay, some members can leave. And so it can expand or contract. I think for folks who are individuals on this call who might not be a member of Slow Food, there's a form on our webpage that we've put here, /Social Alchemy Pod, SAP. And you let us know where you're based, what you're interested in. And we are rolling out a whole new generation of these pods in the spring, sometime in May. And so those are going to get going pretty soon, and we'll be getting people all set up and organized, or if the co-conveners already know who they want to invite, by means they can already bring that group together, and we'll get you all set up with access to the guidebook.
Excellent. Thanks, Abrah. I think we had one more question in the chat, or maybe this is just positive feedback, I think. Great. Thank you for answering that question. If anybody else has another question, go ahead and throw it in the Q&A or the chat right now, and we'll answer those up, although you have given a very thorough and well thought out presentation. So thank you for making it so clear and easy to understand. I'm just going to give it a couple more seconds to see if we have another question. Good. So we have some folks on who are looking forward to applying some of these ideas and principles to groups that they are already facilitating. So that is fantastic.
And I think for folks who are already self-organizing and you want some tools just to sort of boost you up around shared leadership in particular, Adam's book and my book, which will be out shortly, but Adam's book is very available. There's a lot of great social archetypes that he discusses around social leadership. And I'd be happy to share with you, Giselle, 1 or 2 exercises from my book that I could just create separate PDFs if you wanted to share when you post this recording.
Great, that would be fantastic.
Yeah.
And on that note, we'll follow up with all of you who are registered for this with links to the book and to the website and to more of Adam and Abrah's work and that exercise and so on and so forth. So you can take what you learned today and carry it on and start working on these concepts in your work or in your life. We do have one question that maybe we'll just make this the last question, which is how will the pods be connected and what is the method of communication or the medium of communication, which I think is an interesting question right now. So yeah. Maybe we can talk about right now and maybe what's ideal. Totally,
yeah. So ideally, the pods that are interested and where it's practical, the pods themselves would be meeting in person. Obviously, that can't happen right now. So all of both the pod convenings themselves, as well as how the pods would be connected to each other, would happen probably through video chats like this one, as well as with kind of more asynchronous online platforms. And we're still figuring out the exact design of that platform, but what we know is that the pods themselves, they set their own schedule of when they meet. And then we have scheduled meetings for co-conveners. So the different people who are bringing different pods together, they all get a chance to get together and network once a month.
Excellent. Perfect. Well, thank you so much for this. I will let you give us the final goodbye and anything else you'd like to add, but just want to say thank you so much from Slow Food for being here with us today. This has been really, really informative and interesting for me, and I'm sure the same for everyone who's joined us today. So thank you if you joined us today. Check out what's coming up next on Slow Food Live. We've got a full schedule for the rest of the week and lots more great people and cool topics coming up soon. Adam and Abrah, it's a real treat to have you here today. I'm very grateful for your time and feel lucky to have you in our slow food world. And thank you for your wisdom. And I'll let you add anything else to that, and then we'll let folks go, and we'll follow up with you soon and get this on YouTube so you can watch it later if you missed it.
Thanks so much for that, Giselle. It was really wonderful to share this afternoon with you all, and excited to see the ripples that may come from our time together. And I think I'll just end by saying, the idea of quarantine and social distancing can really tug on some early material. And what I mean by that is like early things that happened to us in our childhood around separation. It could be separation because of class and race, and that's not what we came into this world expecting. We thought we could throw our arms around everyone and have everyone, or for some of us, we were sent away to boarding school or punished in our room. And so I think there are some very early emotional feelings about being separated from other humans. And so to notice that now as adults, we really have the opportunity and agency to make different choices. And I know that sometimes our early patterns can run that sort of isolation narrative and sink into ourselves. But I really want to invite everyone to reach out if that is something you're struggling with. Something that I had to do a few weeks ago to remind myself of this was put the names of like 25 or 30 dear friends up on a chalkboard in my kitchen to remember that they're still there, and that I want to, even if it's by text, a quick check-in with every person once a week to really like undo any of those early hurts or feelings that are getting triggered in this time of quarantine. So whatever little things work for each of us to remember how deeply held, connected, and how much belonging we each have during this difficult period.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add to that. Thank you for reminding us of that, Abrah. And thank you, Giselle, for welcoming us into this amazing series of conversations that you all are curating at Slow Food. Really appreciate the chance to interact with folks, and really hope to continue weaving this web ever tighter in the days and weeks to come.